I think one of the great tensions was the relationship between people and nature. And it was truly a tension. This year, you may know, we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of our national park system, which was established in 1916. And embedded in that was the tension between what are we preserving these for? We're preserving them for nature, for itself, or in the words of the Organic Act of the National Park Service, for the enjoyment of future generations. And there has been that real tension about the relationship between people and nature. I think the very nature of this group meeting here today signals that the modern conservation movement has, for the most part, resolved that tension. There's no question. There are almost 7.5 billion of us on this planet. To suggest that we're not intimately part of nature, we are part of nature everywhere. There's no question about our impacts on nature, but there's also no question about our dependency on nature, and to some extent, the dependency of nature on us. And I think if we look at particularly resourceful communities, but we can pick out a whole variety of conservation movements, and particularly the grassroots movements such as here, that connection embodied in the notion of the triple bottom line, I think really makes clear that relationship.
Let me say, though, before I answer your question directly, how much I appreciate what you and your team are doing, not just for the Conservation Fund, but for conservation more broadly and our nation more broadly. Last night, Mickey and I were talking about this particular group of participants in this convening, and she said, when you look up at the audience, you see the future of conservation. And I like her enthusiasm. But I would prefer to say that when I look out at you today, I see a model of what the future conservation movement could be. But there's still a lot of attitudes to change. There's still a lot of practices to change. There's still a lot of policies to change. And so I would offer a little caution, though appreciating your enthusiasm. I like to think when I look at what you're doing, and from the first day I learned about Resourceful Communities, I have felt that you are a model that can demonstrate that diversity need not divide. That pluralism, rightly understood and rightly practiced, is a benefit and not a burden. And even more important, that the fear of difference is a fear of the future. That's what you are, a model that is demonstrating something our society badly needs to understand. Now, to get to your question, what do I consider to be the most important strides made in the conservation movement? I would say that the emergence of advocates within conservation for social justice is the most important stride that I have seen. I grew up on a farm in rural parish in Louisiana, and I developed a great appreciation for the land. I stood in awe of the majesty and mystery of nature. But I must say that when I met conservationists, they tended to be a wealthy class romanticizing all things rural, while I was trying and struggling to get away from the poverty and inequalities those things imposed. And so when you talk about expanding the movement, getting wider participation, you have to deal with the consciousness of the past, which was developed totally by someone else. When I say my interest in conservation comes from the perspective of social justice, and I have been in almost every social justice movement over the last 50 years, not just in the United States, but the anti-apartheid movement abroad, et cetera, et cetera. And when I talk about social justice, I'm talking about more than just dealing with inequality. I'm talking about fairness. I'm talking about respect for local cultures and communities. I'm talking about fairness in the negotiation of a contract with local people. I'm talking about making sure that the dignity of local people is maintained. All of that is a part of what I mean by social justice. So, there's a lot we can learn from the past, and I hope we'll spend some time talking about the present, where I think I may have even more to contribute.
Well, I'm going to pick up where I left off. And so if you think about the history of the environmental movement, Mickey started with Teddy Roosevelt back in the early 20th century, and the creation of the National Park Service, the additions to the National Wildlife Refuge Service system. It was really about protecting resources from the people. Back then, there were robber barons who were liquidating our magnificent forests and mining operations, destroying our rivers. It really was this wholesale exploitation of the natural resources. And Teddy Roosevelt came in and said, no, we've got to stop that. And so he created these mechanisms, the National Park Service, the Forest Service, to protect these resources. And that model lasted for decades, until after World War II, until Rachel Carson, as I mentioned, published Silent Spring, and the second era of the environmental movement came in, what I would call the era of regulation. And at that time, the movement was about stopping the worst pollution, the worst from happening. We can stop almost any project. For 50 years, we have built up a movement around saying no. But the result is that we have developed almost no capacity to say yes. The environmental movement can tell you exactly what it's against, but has a really hard time telling you what it's for. And so as I look back over the evolution, the growth of the movement, this reliance on legislation, litigation, and regulation served a wonderful purpose, accomplished magnificent things, but has left us less than capable of designing the future that we want and articulating it in such a way that we can carry the people with us. And so if I could go back, Mickey, that's what I would change.
What I'd like to see done differently relates to what I said earlier. I would have wished that the movement had been more inclusive from the beginning. Inclusive in both its composition and in its message. Now, when I talk about composition, I think of the potential that was missed if there had been collaboration between the civil rights movement and its network, and the conservation movement and its network. Both working together for not just conservation, not just civil rights, but having people understand how those relate to each other. And I say not just inclusiveness in the composition, but also in the message, the narrative, about why conservation for people who are in poverty and have so many other priorities. The narrative and the message for those people in conservation about collaboration being in their self-interest. It's not just a moral obligation we're talking about. It's not just a civic imperative. We're talking about enlightened self-interest of the conservationist, to have a message that appeals to a broad group of people, and to have models that demonstrate the seriousness about that message.
So as I look back, and it tend to reflect on the challenges that the conservation movement has had in differentiating between what I would call peace thinking and systems thinking. And historically, I think we could honestly say that that in the name of conservation, some pretty awful things have been done historically, and sometimes with good intentions, but with unintended consequences. Aldo Leopold once said that conservation and conservation management was akin to a child playing with a very complex machine, and that we were tinkerers. And he said, the first rule of intelligent tinkering is don't throw away the pieces. And yet, in many situations, we've done exactly that. And this notion of peace thinking, of getting ourselves to think about the complexity of the systems, both human and natural, that we deal with is really important. These interconnections are really critical, and it is what makes efforts in biodiversity conservation, for example, so important. But my point is that I think through the history of conservation, we're slowly coming to the notion of being systems thinkers, of understanding that whatever we're doing in the context of something much larger, that what we're doing influences that larger world, and that larger world is critical for the conservation of what we're doing. And I think that's essential, and something we've missed in the past.
Well, let me begin with what Norm was talking about in terms of the Park Service. The Park Service happened to be one of the agencies, bureaus, in which I had some responsibility for oversight when I was the then called Undersecretary, now called Deputy Secretary. I visited many of those beautiful places that I had not seen before, and many I had not even heard of before. And I marveled at that magnificence and at the fact that this land had been preserved for public use. But what I found is that these crown jewels in our history were in places that were not accessible to a large percentage of our population living either in poverty or just simply in urban areas. And so one of the things Cecil Andrus and I sought to do was we developed an urban parks initiative to try to encourage and support the development of parks that were accessible to urban populations. When I think about what you can do to help shape the future of the conservation movement, I think of the need for a new consciousness of conservation as it relates to the obligations of citizenship. We are stewards of natural resources. All of the great religions talk about this stewardship as a moral imperative. But even beyond that, we are going to need to work with communities to reimagine and reaffirm the centrality of community in the American narrative. You know, in South Africa, there is a concept of community called Ubuntu, which is best understood by the Xhosa proverb, people are people through other people. It is not the Western notion of I think, therefore I am. It is a tribal notion of I am because you are. It means to diminish your humanity is to diminish mine. To deny your dignity is to deny mine. That's the concept of community, and it's interesting that I go not back to Alexis de Tocqueville, Robert Putnam, but I go back to a concept of community in Southern Africa to best explain the consciousness we need in order to exercise this obligation and feel a sense of obligation, not just to ourselves, but to nature. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I might make a comment. I think I want to be sure I'm looking at the question. I think that we run a danger in the conservation movement of too often confusing our goals and the means that we wish to get them. We too often define our measures of success in ways that in many ways don't really reflect what it is we truly want. So get onto websites for many conservation groups, and the measure of success will be maybe acres conserved. There's usually some reason why we want to conserve land. That is, there are underlying motives. Those motives could be nature, they could be historical, they could be cultural, they could be a combination of all of those things. So I think it's incredibly important to be very careful about the measures. That isn't to say that something like number of acres conserved isn't important, but you might call it a leading indicator, something that yeah, we want to do that, but then dig deeper. What do those acres represent? Are they the right acres? Are they in the right place? Are they bounded in ways that have real meaning for the goals that we're trying to achieve?
Well, I would make my remarks about young people and reconnecting young people to nature. Over the last 30 or 40 years, with the growth of technology, young people have become increasingly separated from nature, and I think with disastrous consequences for their physical, emotional, spiritual well-being. And I think also with potentially disastrous consequences for the environment and the environmental movement. And the environmental movement was designed as something totally different. Think about the history of the movement, preserving these magnificent places that are now national parks or wildlife refuges, far away, distant. The environmental movement defined nature as wildness. And the result is that nature is now like some foreign country that you get to visit maybe once in your life if you're lucky. It's not nearby, it's not accessible, it is not relevant to the future of this country, blacker, browner, more urban. And young people are paying the price. All of these childhood maladies, obesity, diabetes, asthma, depression, heart disease, are all disproportionately visited upon children of color, particularly in urban areas. And yet, we spend $2.5 trillion in this country treating disease, and less than 5% of our healthcare budget preventing disease. What I think what I think we need to do is reverse that equation. We need, as Jim said, we need to bring nature back into the place where people live. We can't bring these kids out to nature. You can't take a young girl or a young boy from inner city Washington, D.C. and plop them down in Yellowstone for a week and expect that to be a meaningful experience. It's too big a leap. It's like taking them to the moon. We need the most creative people, the most empathetic people, the people who can understand complexity and find a way through. And so we need to bring nature back to these kids. And as I look to the future of the movement, it's about young people. It's about reconnecting young people to nature. It's about the future health and well-being of this great country in this world that we live in.
There are 7.5 billion of us. We're having all of these different effects. And so, as we reflect back on history, I think it's important to realize that the world, in all of those ways, has never been the same twice. People have always affected the world, have done it in different ways. And what that, I think, tells us is, as we reflect on history, we want to be careful to be able to use it as a foundation to build forward, but never be constrained by it, to never allow it to define our future in some particular way. Which brings me to a related point, and that is that conservation in all of its manifestations, whether we're talking about communities, whether we're talking about national parks or whatever, is, as Alva Leopold said, an incredibly complex endeavor. In fact, there's so much that we don't know and understand about it. Mark Twain once commented that it's not what you don't know that will hurt you, though. It's what you know for certain that just ain't so. And this is where it's really important for us to not let our history constrain our thinking moving forward. I recently spoke to our graduating students at the next school and trying to suggest to them what they ought to think about in their futures. And you know, these are people that are coming out and they know a great deal, but the thing I think is most important is that as we move forward and think about our future is actually the humility to understand that there is so much that we don't know. There's a great deal that we can learn. And it's really important, I think, for our conservation organizations to be very explicit, to build that kind of learning into the organization, to be willing at any given time to challenge even your most closely held ideas, hold them up, not only to the past, but to the future, because things will be different. So I think building learning organizations is incredibly important.
For 100 years in this country, the environmental movement has been a top-down enterprise. It was structured that way, the philosophy is that way, the mindset, and for good reason it started like that and achieved remarkable things because of that. But it feels to me as if we have or are nearly at the end of the usefulness of top-down. That real progress going forward will be from the ground up. And what I see here, what Mickey and her team and all of you have been doing for more than 2 decades now, is the best of what we can envision when we think about ground up. The challenge is that we have to overcome, as Jim said, the institutional bias toward top-down. That real change only comes when those in higher office, those at the highest level of our organizations, public, private, or nonprofit, make a decision or allocate resources. And I think we have to demand that the movement swim downstream, that we have to stop thinking about these centralized institutions as the place where change can happen, where leadership resides, where results emanate from. That going forward, real change, real progress, real results will come from you, will come from the bottom up. But with that, we need to think about how we gain strength, how we gain muscle. I will tell you, as I travel all across this great country, I've been in 49 states. I've never been in Hawaii, so if anybody wants to invite me there, that would be nice. But as I travel all across this magnificent land, I don't see other organizations like this. I see individual organizations of which you all represent, but I don't see the strength that comes from numbers. And so we need to go beyond thinking about what we're doing in our community, what we're doing in our neighborhood. We need to think about how we come together. And that doesn't mean forming the next great, big, monstrous organization. It means that we're a collection of local, cottage scale, if you will, operations. But together, we command the attention, the resources, and the minds of the people of this country. So what I see here in Resourceful Communities is unique, but it shouldn't be so. It should be everywhere.